Hello, everyone. Welcome to the CareWork Network series on chatting with CareWork scholars. The series is called Research Reflections, and today with us we have Dr. Joan Tronto. Dr. Tronto's work needs no introduction. She's a leading political theorist whose work has fundamentally shaped our contemporary understanding of care, democracy, and ethics. Her work challenged the assumption that care is is a private apolitical activity, and instead showed how it is deeply political in nature and is foundational to how societies are organized. It is a pleasure to have you with us, Joan. I'm Anunita Chatterjee, a second year PhD student at the University of Calgary in the Department of Sociology. And
Uh,
with me is, yes.
yeah, and I'm Chetna Khandelwal, a PhD candidate in sociology at the University of Calgary. And to begin with, Joan, we would love to know, how did you first become interested in care research?
Well, there was no such thing really as care research when I became interested in care research. Um, how I became interested was really two ways, an intellectual and a political route. The intellectual route came from reading Carol Gilligan's In a Different Voice and recognizing that this debate between a universal form of morality and forms of morality that didn't claim to be universal, but which still were recognizably moral, was a debate that had already happened in the 18th century in the Scottish Enlightenment. And I thought, well, that's weird. Where does that come from? And, on page 2 of In a Different Voice, Carol Gilligan says that the different voice is a difference of um, theme, not gender, right? And as a result, it occurred to me from the very beginning that we need to be very focused on recognizing that care is not about um, gender. It's about something that's broader. So that's one way. Um, um, so the political angle. Early in my career as a political scientist, I was asked to teach a course on women in politics. There were no such courses really anywhere in the U.S. at the time, and so I made a course up. And one of the things I did was I ended up talking about what I called the feminist nightmare. And the feminist nightmare was that women would fulfill what the now statement of purpose said, that women would join men in the mainstream of American society now. And I asked myself the question, if that happens, what will the consequences be? Suppose women no longer are limited to being teachers, librarians, secretaries, housewives, but can be nuclear physicists and whatever they want. Um, what will happen? And I realized that what would happen, or here's what I thought of as the feminist nightmare, is that having ended the caste system of gender, what we would create instead is a deeply classed system in which all of the care work that has been done in the household would be relegated to people of lower class status, and only relatively well off women would reap the benefits of being able to be somewhere else and someone else. So I started to think, well, that led me to think about what's care really, and why is it so important? And what would it mean if suddenly women weren't attached to care? Now, on one hand, it's good for women not to be attached to care, in that care needs to be for everyone. But on the other hand, if it becomes a marker of lower caste status and lower class status, then it will continue to be dishonored and devalued. No, I said, that's wrong, because care really does matter. It is it's the thing that keeps us humans alive. So both intellectually, thinking about everyday ethics, and politically, thinking about how do we make sure that we don't create this feminist nightmare, I was led to think about care. By the way, I think I'm right. The feminist nightmare happened. The greater inequality that exists today is partly a result of Um, the changing dynamics of households as a result of care. It's a result of the internationalization of the care market for care workers. It's a result of all kinds of ways that have worked out badly for for women, for men, and especially for women and men who are not as well off.
Well, I was quickly going to say what you were talking about really reminded me of even what happened with the second wave feminist movement and many of the critiques that came of it, whose care was valued and whose wasn't. Like I was making a lot of connections and that was really powerful. So thank you.
Yeah, yeah. I had to say that when I reread Betty Friedan and the way she talks about housework and about care work, it's kind of like, I don't want this to be part of the movement I'm part of.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that actually, the next question kind of takes us to an interesting route as well, if you want.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah. For me, it was also making me think about like the books that we have been reading on racial capitalism and how care is not just class, but also racialized in the way that it's taking form now, right? But
Always
yeah,
been racialized, but it's even
yeah,
worse now, or it's taken a new form now. It's always
yeah,
been racialized. Yeah.
yeah. So I guess on that line, the question that I had was, what is your current care research project? Where do you see it going?
Yeah. So what I've been doing for the last several years is trying to finish a book, which isn't finished yet. I write very slowly. But what I want to do is talk about bad care. I want to talk about the ways in which care goes wrong. And actually, the tentative title I have, taken partly from Nancy Fulbray, is A Field Guide to Bad Care. And the worst thing that happens with regard to care in the world today is global capitalism,
Yeah.
which does not appreciate care and treats it as an externality to the economic system. And the economic system is just completely distorted and directed against caring. Now, this would it be possible to rein capitalism in? I'm a little agnostic on that, right? I think it would be possible. But the current model of financialized capital, which is aimed at ever increasing return on investment, ever increasing amounts of money, definitely does not consider care to be important. Uh, Every time I think of this, I think of Mark Zuckerberg saying, move fast and break things. That's the way he wants the world to operate. And all I can think of is, and after you've broken everything, who do you think is going to clean up the mess?
Mhm.
What happens to that mess? Because when you break things, it leaves a mess, baby. And they're completely oblivious to that reality, that that's part of the outcome of what they're doing. But it is, I mean, environmentally, this is what we've done now to the world for 150 or 250 years. It's really, we've created a mess. And it's time now for us to think about how to clean it up. So, one piece of this is capitalism. Another piece of it is we've already mentioned racism is a part of bad care, right? This way in which even back in 1995, Uma Narayan published a piece about British colonialism, in which she said it was sent off as a form of care.
Mhm.
Mhm.
That's how you persuaded people to be imperialist, was to say that you were caring for the other people and this and civilizing them. Like India needs civilization from the West. Its civilization is 4,000 years older. Never mind. Um, so these kinds of arguments are always made to justify something. It's not that they're uncaring, it's that they're caring about the wrong things. They're caring about wealth, they're caring about racial domination. And then the third thing that they're caring about, and this is gendered really in a deep way, but it's also more generalizable, is protection.
Mhm.
Protection is always used as a model of care, and it's always used by men as a model of care, and it's always a bad model of care. It's a bad model of care from a democratic perspective, and that's where I'm starting from from a democratic perspective, because in order to protect some, you have to presume there are enemies, that there are others out there who are beyond redemption, beyond inclusion, beyond being worthy of your attention. So protection is always presuming that the enemy already exists. And if you start from that framework, then there will always be bad care. There will always be exclusion. There will always be damage to others on behalf of ours. And I mean, that seems to be kind of like humans do this a lot, but it's also a form of bad care. So those are the kinds of things I'm thinking about now, in terms of bad care.
Yeah, thank you. That was, I really look forward to learning more about this strand of your research where we pay attention also to who is neglected and the exclusions that are made in
Right.
care, in service of caring for others and the privileges that play out in that dynamic. Actually, super relatedly, I was really honored and delighted to know from my supervisor, Dr. Pallavi Banerjee, that you were interested in our co-authored paper on deep care. And in that paper, we had argued that the work of marginal feminist organizing is embedded in what we called deep care. And that signifies care that's fundamentally oriented towards engaging in care labor that counters the same kind of erasure of subjectivities that we've been talking about here that's undergone by marginalized communities in the face of structural oppression. And this is also interwoven then with the praxis of everyday care. And we saw a resonance here between the concept of deep care and then your work on the transnational commodification of care, democratic politics, and this need to approach citizenship with care as sort of a central principle there. So, my question, my very long-winded question is, in the current political context of the global north, particularly the US, if the work of care inherently resists this commodification, as we've seen in your work, could we seek to foster transnational feminist solidarity through either care or even deep care?
Well, that's a big question. Let me say something about deep care first. So, deep care is, if you'll let me put it this way, the optimistic other side of bad care. Bad care has excluded some people and said they're beyond our interest.
Mm.
And in a way, deep care is taking those people's practices of care, people who have been oppressed, who are not given the resources they need to care well, and asking them, in spite of that, how do they manage? And if you will, care in bad situations, it happens all the time, right? People are always in, not all people are all the time, but in many, many cases we can think of, people are put in really horrible situations and still they need to live. And in order to live, they need to care. And they need to figure out a way to somehow organize their lives so that the caring work that's needed can go on. And
Mhm.
that's what I take deep care to be about.
Mhm.
So, so is it possible to create a transnational solidarity out of that? Well, in the first place, people have to recognize that they're in this situation of deep care, right? Um, uh, a few weeks ago, I was speaking to some scholars who are working with groups that are trying to raise funds for people who need to leave certain states in the US to go elsewhere because their abortion rights have been terminated, right? And that seems to me to be a kind of deep care by the language that you guys use. That is, it's a way to try to fix a situation that's become really untenable for people to do what they need to do to care for themselves and nonetheless somehow figure out a way to organize it. So there are lots of there are examples everywhere of people doing deep care work, doing this work of finding a way despite all the odds of surviving. Um, in almost every city in North America now, it's unaffordable for most people to live. Even if you're working full time, making the minimum wage, you are not going to be able to earn enough money to to rent a place to live, not even a nice place to live, any place to live. This is really kind of, when you think about it, unbelievable. But what's really hard is that people don't see that situation as somehow politically tied to the situation of all the other people who are engaged in the same kind of deep care.
Right.
You know, it, if you go back to Marx, to the Communist Manifesto, he says of the workers, we are nothing but should be everything. And there's a way in which we are trying to care for everything. We are trying to care for what we care about. We are trying to make it, and we can't. But all of us deserve care. And if there were some way to create that solidarity, it would be the basis for a global movement of change, of inclusion, against this idea that it's power and strength that makes us uh, valuable, or money that makes us valuable. It's really hard to get there, right? Because, among other reasons, because people are so desperately working hard every day to just make ends meet, to live their lives, to do the care work and to receive the care that they need for themselves, right? So, under those really difficult situations, it's hard to even see that what you're doing is a form of deep care. But if we were to be able to get people to recognize that, it might go better. Now, one way that the Care Work Network has brought me to recognize something that's really important here as a way to make this happen is to start thinking about care as a human right. Because once we start to recognize that care is a human right, it's one of those things that we need in order to live. And we need to be able to care well for the people who care for us, who, who we want to care for. We need to be able to receive care when we need it. Um, and we need to be able to do that in a way that's democratic and that's inclusive. And then my colleagues in Latin America would also insist that we add self-care there, although in the in the North context, it's so distorted by neoliberalism and economic values that I tend not to talk about self-care here. But it
Mhm.
is an important part of what we all need too. When we put those pieces together and say that if that's a human right, then look what we're being denied. Look what we don't have when we have to scrounge around for money to set up a GoFundMe page for a surgery, right? As
Mhm.
happens in the US. Under these conditions, people are not being well cared for. People are not being cared for at all. No. And so, under those circumstances, people are in doing deep care, but they don't recognize their solidarity with everyone else. So it's a hard question always of how do you get people to recognize that they are in the same boat as everyone else and that it's time for them to act politically to do this.
Mhm.
Can I say a little more about this? One of the works that's been really influential to me over my lifetime, thinking about this question of how do you start a movement, how do you get people to act, has to do with the claims made by Piven and Cloward in their books, Poor People's Movements and Others. And what they say is this: people don't revolt or get angry or organize because they're in bad situations. They do it because they see that there is someone else who is deliberately putting them in that bad situation and that there's a way to act to change it. What's so interesting about care is it's been so private for so long that nobody thinks about the fact that, oh my God, today I have to both take my kid to school and take care of my mother and take care of my sister. They don't see that that isn't their fault. That isn't their problem. It's the problem of the way we've organized our society so that, in fact, it's impossible to do all those three things at once. But if you think it's your failing, then you're never going to become political about it. And we are led over and over again to think of it as individual failing rather than collective failure. So part of the way to solve that is to point out who's responsible for making it work this way. And secondly, but it's so complicated because it's not one person, right? It's not, you can't point to that polluter has ruined our river, right? You can do that with a river that's being polluted. You can't do that with the fact that the care system is just completely non-existent and not thought of from the standpoint of care.
Mhm.
Right. I mean, one of the things one example I use often has to do with school schedules. Why aren't school schedules aligned to the work schedules of parents? And
Yeah.
the vacations don't line up, the hours of the day don't line up, and it's a real problem for parents.
Mhm.
It could be fixed, right? It would take somebody saying, "This is a problem, let's fix it." But no one's done anything to address this, and instead there are all these makeshift ways of trying to put together a child care center and fund child care centers and all these other things. Child care centers are actually wonderful. I like them. I would create them and have them exist anyway. But under what conditions would you not have um, vacations aligned, days of the week aligned? It just doesn't make any sense, right? If someone were thinking of this from the outside, they would say, "Look at this crazy thing we've done."
Mhm.
It then and so people blame people are really busy, and then they blame themselves, and then there's very little way to organize.
Mm.
So the transnational solidarity becomes even another layer of difficulty to add on after this. But you are quite right that in a way, people are in very similar bad situations everywhere. Sorry, that's a long-winded answer to your question.
No, I like the tie-in between holding structures accountable as a means to gain solidarity, and that it doesn't come inherently from a recognition of being in a bad situation. It comes from knowing who's putting you in it, and then that is also building solidarity to go towards movement building and social change, and that's really powerful.
Yeah, it is, but it's also really hard because which structures are you going to hold accountable? The
Mm,
structure that's most um, responsible for care everywhere in the world is the family. And
right.
th
Yeah.
the family structure, although there are reasons why families are the way they are, it's very difficult to say that to people. Well, you know why your family is the way it is. People aren't gonna, rise up against the family, right? Um, and you wouldn't want them to necessarily. You want them to make sure that bad families somehow are controlled, but you wouldn't want them to rise up. The family makes some perfect sense, that there are intimate people who know what you need, who help you with those meeting those needs, and who you feel that you're doing something because you're helping them meet their needs. And that's that kind of mutuality, which is part and parcel of what family life is a very precious part of human existence. But on the other hand, it's also that the fact that this is all contained in the family, most of it is contained in the family, it spills out and comes in everywhere. That makes it institutionally very difficult to challenge. Yeah.
Yeah. I was just thinking about how you were talking about those who fall outside the ambit of care when we
Yeah.
think about bad care, and also the structure of family. And this sort of really ties into my next question, but also my work, which looks at women who are sex workers and who have
Uh-huh.
children. Basically. So, my work has been on caregiving and receiving among marginalized youth, so the children of the sex workers in India. And I'm using both deep care because I deeply resonated with that paper and like the concept of it, and also your work on receiving care to frame my work. In this context, care that is political and rooted in the margins. How do you envision the care received by children and youth growing up where institutional and familial structures essentially fail to care for them?
Yeah, it's really hard for children for whom care, the institutions of family, which, as I said, is, the institution that's supposed to do this. When
Mm.
that fails, kids, they are really lost, right? They have really a very difficult time. So what have you discovered? My guess is that the children somehow find a way among themselves to create a way to care for each other.
Yeah, and also for their mothers. Like
Yes,
that part of receiving and giving care is very interesting. It is outside the ambits of all institutions that do not see them as the perfect families or good families. But the care that they have is really deep, and it is really, they advocate for one another. And it's quite interesting to think about receiving care in that context. And I was wondering if you could like talk a little more about that.
no, you should talk a little more about it because it sounds like this is a really good example of where that exchange of giving and receiving care is fundamental.
Right.
It's not a one-way street. And almost
Mhm.
always when we think of care, we think of ourselves as the great caregivers and someone else who's in a lesser position as care receivers. But you're quite right. Children are often giving care to their parents, and in these situations, they're often called upon to do all kinds of things to help their parents out. Um, and it's really difficult to try to think of what an institutional framework would look like that was different, except if the workers were protected, there was no shame in the work, right?
Mhm.
And all of these things, which sadly aren't happening.
Yeah.
Mm.
So good for you to, it's a really good example of this, of the complexity of how care relations exist.
Yeah. And how deeply political it is. Because even if care exists in the intimate relationships, the lack is a result of the failing institutions. Like
Right.
they could care for each other, but there's so many things stopping them.
Among them, the criminality of that of sex work, so that one of the other party is going to end up in jail, the absence of resources, the absence of steady employment, the ways in which the schools treat the children. I mean,
Yeah.
it's just, yeah, you know.
Well, I do have a small follow-up on what you said. When you
Sure.
were talking, I was thinking about this idea of almost transacting in care. And from reading some of your work, I've learned how it's difficult to really measure that way in which care is received and given. And I'm wondering what might be a different way to envision care and its structure and how it shows up in the world than looking at it as this transaction.
That's a good question. And I guess I don't have a really good answer, but I have an answer. And that is, it goes back to the original paper that Berenice Fisher and I wrote about the nature of care. It has to do with the ways in which we can think of care as a holistic process, right? So if we're thinking of care as whole, hold on a second. Um, this is a really interesting question. And my best answer for this has to do with thinking back to the paper we wrote in 1990, well, it was published in 1991, I guess, um, in which we argued that care is a holistic process. And so what I would do now if someone asks me, well, you can't measure care, well, it doesn't really exist, blah, blah, is to think about the difference between vicious circles and virtuous circles of care. So it's not measuring a particular, it's not like we have a carometer that we can attach to somebody or even to a dyad, because that's not the way care works. It's not dyadic, it's not individual, it's complex. It exists in a system. And in a system, we know that some things have bad consequences and some things have good consequences. And if you go and think about a process of care and ask, is it creating bad consequences or good consequences? You have a way of maybe not measuring, but at least making sense of what's going on.
Mhm.
I'll give you an example that I think is really useful. And actually, at the last Care Work Network conference, I heard a wonderful paper about school lunches, a wonderful panel about school lunches, actually. There's several papers. And it's a really good example of this. So if I'll use the example of I used to live in Minnesota, and in the state of Minnesota, parents had to pay for the school lunch a week at a time. And if they didn't pay, their kid didn't get the hot lunch that everyone else was getting. They were given a cheese sandwich, two slices of bread with a piece of cheese between them.
Mhm.
Now imagine if you're the kid whose parents can't afford or just forgot to pay the school lunch bill, and you're given one of these bad lunches while everyone else is eating something hot. It may not even be good, but it's hot, right? And it's the point is it's different because those kids are stigmatized by getting this bad lunch.
Mhm.
What does it cost instead of that to provide the same meal to everybody? And in fact, since I've left Minnesota, Democrats took over the government of the state and provide free breakfast and free lunch to every kid in the school. That means that parents don't have to prepare lunch. And in other places in New Zealand, when I looked at this issue there, one of the things that happened was that the kids held rituals of thanks for the people in the cafeteria who prepared the food for them. So think of all the good things they were, and there was a rule that they should try to use local foods. Think of all the good things you can do by feeding local, nutritious, well prepared by local people who know the cuisine food versus any other system that you might think of, right?
Right.
And it's so interesting. This is just such a small example, but it shows the difference between what a bad care system looks like because it just keeps causing more and more bad care and unintended
Mhm.
consequences that are bad versus a system that's a virtuous circle of care where the care has the effect of making people who receive it more caring and more caring and more caring. So I guess that's the answer to the question. What you really know is people who receive care and, if you will, pass the care along or become more caring, then you have good care.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really powerful how that ties in morality into these discussions as well, right? And actually, based on that, I'm also curious then, what do you wish the general public knew about your research?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I've been thinking about how to answer that and well, frankly, how to do it. And the big thing is that I think care is actually a different paradigm about the way we should be living. Rather than thinking about wealth and domination, we should be thinking about living well, being joyful, and caring for all the things around us. We can't care for everything, right? But if all of us care more for the things that are close to us or that matter to us, we can imagine a world in which there's enough care to go around. I mean,
Mhm.
there's never enough care, right? People people inevitably die. It's part of human existence that we inevitably die. We will always fail at care. On the other hand, we can care better or worse. And to try to orient ourselves to care better would be a way to make the world a much more hospitable place for everyone. For everyone. Yeah. Um, there a former senator from Minnesota who died in a plane crash, Paul Wellstone, put it this way. He said, "We all do better when we all do better." And it's really true. Um, it's such a simple statement. And it's such a contrast to the view, for example, that Margaret Atwood puts in The Handmaid's Tale in the mouth of the commander when he says, playing Scrabble, better always means better for some and worse for others, right? Those are two very different ways of thinking about better.
Mm.
And I think We all do better when we all do better is something that a democratic society should subscribe to, rather than thinking about who are we going to reward and who are we going to punish.
Right. I think in the same vein as you're talking about, like we all do better when we all do better, what advice would you have for students who are interested in doing care research on similar topics and to take care research forward?
Yeah, the most important thing is that you have to, and I encourage everybody to be interested in it. And it's part of our daily life, and it's part of a way to honor ourselves
Mm,
and to turn what we know into joy, you know? Sometimes people get criticized by advisors and readers in the field, especially in the social sciences, because they're engaging in not research, but me search. Have you heard that expression? And I think that's wrong. There are in everybody's life a set of experiences that are worthy of exploration and which may not fit the existing models in sociology and political science, but that's the worst for the models, not the worst for the practices. So you need to be working on a theoretical level, but you also need to be honest and truthful and find something that has meaning and resonance in your own life in order to do the research about it. And if it doesn't have meaning and resonance in your own life, then why are you doing it? Now, some people think of scholarship kind of as a game, and this methodological turn that has happened in all the social sciences, the more sophisticated system of analysis, running some complex mathematical formula to determine what people's intersecting ideas are really about. It seems to me that's really the wrong way to go. But it is easier if what you're trying to do is just play games and produce more numbers.
Mhm.
That's not what we should be doing. And I encourage people to kind of be true to themselves about what it is they actually want to know about and think about. If I could, there's one more word I want to use here, and that word is wonder. Everybody should, one of the most valuable qualities we have as humans is our ability to wonder about the world. And what's
mm,
interesting to me is how much our educational system seems to crush the wonder out of people,
mm,
to not make them wonder or ask questions or think about what's going to happen or be interested beyond what's going to be on the test, right? And it's a failure of imagination, and imagination is one of the things that makes us human, and frankly, which makes care better. Um, and so, in our research and in thinking about doing care research, start from a question that you're wondering about, and then see where it takes you. Maybe that's a hopeful answer. I hope so.
it is. Thank you.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It challenges the unidirectional top-down way in which we've been taught to learn. And bringing wonder into it just really would flip that upside down, hopefully. So thank you.
Yeah, it's really important that we recognize that we've devised an educational system that doesn't really serve our intellectual interests any longer.
Yeah.
Having said that, it's important people know things, right? It's important we know and learn. But on the other hand, we also need constantly to be exercising our imagination and our capacity to dream and to think other. And that we need to do that in all of our classes, not just our literary classes, not just our political theory classes, but also when we're studying sociology, when we're studying biology for that matter.
Mm.
A sense of wonder is critical for um, living a good life, I would say. Yeah. And also for caring well.
Yeah, I was thinking about this. We were asking you about students, but as graduate students, we will also become educators at some
Yeah.
point. And as educators, fostering a sense of wonder might then become a form of care or deep care in some ways. So, yeah.
Yeah, it will. I would often in the first lecture I taught a big lecture class usually, and the first day I would talk to the students about what George Koo, who's a researcher who works on student retention, called the disengagement contract. And
Mm,
what he would say is, seems to be what we've decided. Professors say to students, indirectly, of course, don't ask too much of me, and I won't ask very much of you. I'll give you a
Mm.
good grade if you just follow the rules and see what's in the textbook and spit it back at me. And then I can go off and do my research and not be interested in you or pay any attention to you or think about you. And then we're all better off. No, then we're all worse off. But you can see why it's the kind of contract you'd make in a society that's completely transactional and that completely thinks about grades and diplomas as if they were simply things to collect rather than education as a process of transformation.
yeah.
Yeah. I think it really like brings it back to what you were talking about, which is the cycles of vicious care, which is
It's,
and it also makes me think if it's possible even within like capitalism to have virtuous cycles of care when so much is when everyone's practically being stretched thin.
although it would require a transformation that is pretty remarkable, right? I mean, it would
Yeah.
mean first, in the first place, that we would start to do things like make sure everybody has enough
Yeah.
and tax the people who have too much to make sure that everybody has enough. And, that seems to be like, oh, how could you tax rich people? What a thought. What a thought. They create jobs. No, they don't. That's not where their money comes from. Um,
Mhm.
the amount of wealth that's built up, I get this from McKinsey and Company, who are not, anti-capitalist, but the amount of wealth that's built up in the last 50 years no longer tracks with GDP. GDP is growing like this, and wealth is growing like this. And it's because wealth has no connection to the reality of what's actually being produced, done, managed in a society any longer. Wealth is just a bunch of billionaire numbers being billionaires. And it's extraordinary that we've given them so much power. Just extraordinary. But
Yeah.
no. So I guess in that regard, yes, the vicious circles will continue, and especially as long as we continue on this path, this ever increasing path of we need more and more and more and more wealth. Everything in human life has a limit. Everything on the planet has a limit, but somehow wealth seems not to want to have a limit on itself.
In our research group, we like to think of care as the central analytic that can resist some of this commodification and neoliberalization of the university and learning. And yeah, that's been an
And
interesting.
life and healthcare. Yes. Yeah.
Absolutely.
It's
Well,
a very different worldview if you put care at the center. It really is. Yeah.
yeah. Well, thanks to your work, we get to learn to do that. So, yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
I'm glad to hear that because that's why I do it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, bringing this back to actually the Care Work Network, our last inquiry would be how you've been involved in the Care Work Network and what have you most enjoyed about being part of this collective?
So I admit I have not been very good about caring for the organization itself. I haven't been involved in the organizing of the conferences or the serving on the boards of the meetings and so on. But I have been an active scholar and participant by bringing my scholarship to the CARE Network. And I've got to say, I've also learned so much from participating in the CARE Work Network. During the pandemic, we organized talks online, and it was really great. The idea of wealth care came to me as I was preparing a talk for the Care Work Network. It's in the book that came out of the pandemic, From Crisis to Catastrophe. I gave a keynote speech early on in the history of the network, and I've been involved in once the Care Work Network became freestanding, no longer associated with the ASA, I've encouraged lots of people who are not just sociologists to participate. And the other thing that I've really enjoyed is the international quality of the network and learning from my colleagues in Latin America especially has been a really important part of the ongoing work there. So it's a great organization that provides an opportunity for people doing work around care to meet others, share their research, find an audience that's receptive and at the same time critical. So it's really useful. It's been really useful for me. Personally, it's really great. I thank you all for being there. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you so much for that. Even the care, I joined the Care Work Network like a year ago, and I was able to attend the conference that happened last year,
Oh,
and
you
it
were
was
there? That was great,
amazing.
wasn't it?
Yes, but I mean, I had to do it online because of restrictions.
Ah,
But even the panel that we had there, it was just amazing. And attending some of the other panels, it was. There's so much to learn, and there's so much work, innovative work going on in areas of care. That it's just amazing and really inspiring.
it is. And one of the things that's interesting, I was thinking about this earlier today, is that it is truly interdisciplinary work. And
Yeah.
the field has not yet, if you let me use this language, congealed into a particular form, right? It's not like, um, you start out being a sociologist, and pretty soon you have to decide, are you going to be a sociologist of work, or are you going to be a sociologist of family, or are you going to be a sociologist of the this or the that, or a theoretical
Hmm.
sociologist, you're going to use what kind of methods you're going to use, qualitative, quantitative, blah, blah. In care, we're still doing all that because
Yeah.
all of that touches on the topic. And so it's almost interdisciplinary within itself. And as a result, the work is much more innovative, much more, if you will, wonder-provoking, wonderful, to use that term. Yeah. So it makes me really glad that this is kind of my more intellectual home than the other more established, shall we say, intellectual categories like sociology or political science or philosophy, where my work is often worked and used, read.
Yes. Thank you so much, Joan. This brings us to the end of the interview, and it was an amazing conversation. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you. It's been lovely for me to meet you both and to have this chance to talk about these things. I look forward to seeing you and meeting you again.
Absolutely.
Okay. Be well.
Thank you.
Bye.